Middle East and the implications for Europe and for the US. My name is Rosa Balfour. I'm a senior advisor at the European Policy Center and a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US. And I'm delighted to be here. We have two fantastic panelists. Lina Khatib is currently the head of the Middle East program at Chatham House, based in London, and previously has lived in the region, knows the region, has been working on the region, I think all of your professional career,
yes.
And was previously in Beirut. Andrew Tabler is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, but also has spent a lot of time, many years, in Beirut and in Damascus, in various, working in various organizations. You can see his bio in the booklet here. And we really couldn't have a better insight into the region. And we're going to try and do it from different levels. One would be the international, in particular the transatlantic front, and what options there are, what policy choices there are, given that this is a moment of extraordinary tensions across the two sides of the Atlantic. And many of these tensions actually relate to the Middle East. So we'll be talking about geopolitics of the Middle East and how the various international and regional actors are contributing to the conflicts, the fragilities, and what role they play. But we're also able to look at it from a slightly more grassroots perspective because our panelists know Syria in particular so well. So this really is a great opportunity. I will start with a few questions. First, just look at the big picture issue, what's been happening in the past decade in the region and how this has affected international positioning and choices, how things have changed or not changed. And then we'll move on to looking at Iran. Of course, the JCPOA is the news headline of the day, and then move on to Syria, and then perhaps look again at what policy options there are. So let's start with the big picture. So the Middle East has really moved over the past decade, less so. It's moved from revolution, the period of great optimism with the Arab Spring, through civil wars, which have expanded to become regional conflicts with international involvement. And now we live at a time where we face the fear of a nuclear arms race in the region. So how have international policies changed? And I'd like to start from the US, because until a decade ago, the US was the actor in the region. So Andrew, would you like to say a few words on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to the EPC for inviting us today in the US mission to the EU. You have very dynamic organizations. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Just a few opening remarks, and my remarks are just my own, my personal opinion. I think that, you know, when we were speaking a little bit beforehand about how to set up this panel, and there are a lot of panels, particularly on Syria and Iran, but not only. And I have to say that time and time again, the popular cultural image that comes up is from the film Groundhog Day, which many of you have probably seen. It depicts a small village in my home state of Pennsylvania, in which you seem to be repeating the same day over and over again, and where you get, at bare minimum, a sense of deja vu. The thing that strikes me the most about is the difference between what's going on the ground and what is going on in policy circles. What strikes me in terms of what's going on the ground is the degree to which the major dynamics have been unresolved or remain the same. Very rigid, authoritarian, oftentimes minority-dominated regimes on the one side, which are incapable of reform or anything that we would consider in a Western sense reform. And then we have rapidly growing, particularly rural and oftentimes Sunni populations on the other hand. And this dynamic still goes on to this day, and certainly goes on in the case of Syria, with some tragic consequences. So that has not, unfortunately, that has remained the same. What's also remained the same is many of these governments, and most notably the Assad regime, remain in power, but we'll get into this, I think, a lot in our conversation. However, the degree to which and who is enabling them to stay in power has become largely dependent on the involvement of foreign militia and military operations, particularly by Iran and Russia on the side of the regime. But not only, we have the United States backing the Kurds in the northeastern part of the country. I think the one thing, though, that stayed the same in the policy circles is our responses to the number of black swans that have flown out of the Syria conflict remain the same. Stay out, do little, try to deal with some of the symptoms, but not all of them, not in a comprehensive way, and focus on counterterrorism. This package, this policy package, continues. And the problem is that the conflicts now, particularly in Syria, but not only, while that civil war might be winding down, the fact is the way that civil war is winding down is unacceptable to neighboring countries, particularly Israel and Turkey. And we'll get into that, I'm sure. And that means at this point the Middle East, and particularly around Syria, now threatens to go sideways and draw in many more regional parties and set off something larger and dramatically increasing the threat of interstate conflict.
So it sounds like the demand for policy is essentially a domestic one coming from the US rather than one which is focusing on trying to solve the region. Would you agree? Is this a similar pattern that you view in Europe in general?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, if I were to look at Western policy in general, whether American or European, regarding the region, there is a bit of an adherence to stabilisation above all else, which remains a problem. But there's also the issue of looking at the Middle East as if it's one coherent place. And this is particularly the case with Syria, that many kind of look at through the prism of the mess that is Libya, saying, well, look what foreign intervention did, therefore we should treat Syria, with caution. Or look at the mess that happened in Iraq, and therefore we should not do very much when it comes to Syria. And this is problematic because Libya is not Iraq, and Iraq is not Syria, and all of these countries have very particular dynamics. The other issue is looking at these countries and what's happening within them. Very often, I see Europe, for example, when it comes to Iraq, viewing Iraq from the prism of focusing on favored individuals, which basically blinds us to what is actually happening inside Iraq that may not always be negative. Sometimes it could be positive. So, for example, the latest election results. A lot of people have said they are surprised that the Sadr group won most of the seats, relatively speaking, in this, relative to other groups, not most seats in parliament, but relative to other groups, they won most seats in this election. The West has been, and Europe in particular, heavily focused on Prime Minister Abadi and thinking this is our favorite candidate, most likely this is the guy who's going to win, and he didn't. He, came in kind of trailing behind in terms of how many seats his party got. So on the one hand, you see rigidity in terms of adhering to certain, I would say, conceptual frameworks when it comes to the region, but at the same time, there's lack of understanding of internal dynamics, as well as the lack of understanding of the differences between all the countries. And I think this largely explains why the West in general and Europe have, perhaps not intentionally, but paved the way for regional actors, as well as actors like Russia, to basically claim a role in this region.
And we're going to talk about regional actors and local actors, but just, the latest thing on the news is the US withdrawal from the JCPO agreement, the nuclear non-proliferation agreement with Iran. Can I just ask you, and we'll at the end of the session, I'd like to go back to the transatlantic piece. Can I just ask you, obviously we're in a period of great uncertainty. The decision is recent, although it was on the way. But it doesn't look like partners have been that prepared to face it. And one consequence that doesn't seem to have been looked at extensively is what might this be for Iran internally, and then for the dynamics in the region. So, Lina, maybe you'd like to say something about Iran, because you were mentioning earlier about you don't believe.
I mean, again, Iran is another example of, if I can call them simplistic frameworks that have become very dominant in the West. I'm saying West very, very generally, of course. The simplistic framework of approaching Iran is imagining it as a place in which there's a hardline camp that is in competition with a reformist camp, and they are basically clashing with one another. The reformists wanted the JCPOA, the hardliners didn't, but accepted it in the end, and now they're telling the reformists, I told you so. And now, with the US withdrawing, the hardliners are going to rise at the expense of the reformists because of this competition and because they kind of showed them that they were right and the reformists were wrong. Now, the way I view Iran is a bit more, I would say different. I see Iran as a place in which, if you think about it, presidential elections and any other election are not free in the first place, because you have to have candidates vetted before they are allowed to run. And therefore, someone like President Rouhani, if he had not been deemed useful for the time during which he became president, he would not have been allowed to run in the first place by the Council of Guardians in Iran. So to me, it seems that the hardliners in Iran have always been in charge. However, they are also pragmatic. So viewing them from a purely ideological perspective does not help. And their pragmatism meant that they acknowledged that at that time, just like now, a person like Rouhani is useful for Iran's foreign policy, so we'll have him, in the picture as president. So now with what's happening with the JCPOA, I don't think this is going to result in any internal clash in Iran. However, it will increase the hardliners in Iran, simply because then they can say, well, we did give this JCPOA a chance, and now we've been let down by the United States. We've been betrayed. So it has nothing to do with their supposed competition with reformists, but it has a lot to do with them reaffirming their position vis-à-vis the West towards their own population. So that's one thing to remember. The other thing to remember is the sanctions that were supposed to have been lifted on Iran as a result of the JCPOA were never fully lifted anyway. So the population in Iran did not see a huge positive impact of the JCPOA in the first place. And that explains some of the protests that were, I must say, overblown by the media that happened in December in Iran. They were economic, mostly, in nature. And it's because the economy did not really recover. So now with the JCPOA heading towards being unraveled, so it seems, I don't think that, the population will go, oh, this is such a terrible thing because we lost all these economic opportunities. However, with new sanctions imposed by the US, the situation is likely to get worse. And we all know, sadly, that when the situation gets worse in Iran, the hardliners kind of need to show an iron fist. So we are heading towards, a more hardline position in Iran, but not for the reasons that most people expect.
So, Andrew, can I ask you to look at this also from the point of view of regional dynamics? I mean, we talked about polarization. There's also polarization between Iran, Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia. How is this going to play out? And then maybe from that, look also at the impact on Syria.
So, I mean, I think there are a couple of ways to look at this. One is from the nuclear non-proliferation aspect, which the JCPOA directly deals with.
Yeah.
And that is both Israelis and Arab Gulf countries in particular, but not only, Turkey beyond, we're concerned about Iran's nuclear program. We're concerned about their intentions in terms of making a nuclear device, delivering this payload to these various countries. And I think in that sense, there's the issue of what will these countries do now in terms of responding to the fact that if Iran, for example, restarts its nuclear program, and that's a real conundrum. Yeah. Now, there's another aspect of this, though, and that is, and it was an ancillary aspect to the deal. The deal does just deal with enrichment and the nuclear program. Yeah. I would say that, to be fair to my regional friends and colleagues, I think the problem is that they look at the way Iran behaved in the region after the signature of the agreement, and that called into question their intentions. So what do I mean by that? Yeah. Iranian deployments to Syria, in particular, are off the chart. And one of the challenges of dealing with and responding to the Syrian war in particular, but not only, is that the maps that we use are state-centric maps. So, for example, when you look at a map of how the Syrian war is shaking out, it looks like the red splotch of the Assad regime, it's usually red, is increasing over the territory of Syria, and it's inevitable that juggernaut is going to retake all of Syrian territory, and everything is going to go back to the way it was before. The same could apply actually to the northeastern part of Syria, where we have Syrian democratic forces, which are oftentimes in chartreuse, and that grouping disguises the fact that the YPG Kurds, the offshoot of the PKK, is dominant in that organization. So while we might look at it as the Syrian democratic forces, and then of course we have Turkey's various operations there, and so on. So I think the problem is that the way the war is shaking out, in a state-centric sense, seems to be in favor of the Assad regime holding on, at least into the near future. But the way the region looks at this is dramatically different, because that is where things have definitely changed. It's not Groundhog Day. It's just not normal to have Shia militia flying their flags out the pipeline down towards Abu Kamal, out to overwhelmingly Sunni-dominated areas of Syria. And so I think that Syria becomes, and we were speaking about this a little bit earlier, Syria becomes the arena, but not the only one, but the main arena in which this contestation of power between Israel and Turkey against Iran and the Kurds comes into the fore. But to be fair, the Gulf countries are also worried about Yemen. They're also worried about Iraq. They're worried about lots of these other broken states. And that's the one thing that hasn't changed. We have such pathetic responses to these broken state problems. I'm not blaming the policymakers here. It's a hard policy set. But if we expect anything to change by continuing to do what we're doing, I think we're fooling ourselves.
Lina, what we've seen during the Syrian conflict is a strengthening of alliances, or even new alliances emerging. I'm thinking Israel, Russia, and Turkey, Russia, which sort of patched together their differences of opinion rather quickly, and which showed the degree to which these actors are behaving autonomously from the West as a whole. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on this and how this plays out in the Syrian conflict, but also what to think about for the future in terms of what dynamics these actors could support or not?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Russia-Turkey, Turkey only migrated in the direction of Russia in Syria because it felt it had no other choice. Turkey felt largely let down by the United States in particular, while being put under increasing pressure from Russia. And it felt that, okay, we're going to park ourselves in the Russian camp until we get a signal from the US that things are going to be a bit different. Now the signal may well be happening. If you look at what's going on in the northeast, what Turkey simply wants when it comes to Syria is for this conflict not to enable the Kurds to claim any degree of autonomy. That is it. And this position for Turkey has actually not changed since the beginning of the Syrian conflict. It's probably the only consistent thing when it comes to Turkey's perspective on the Syrian conflict. And if the US gives Turkey a signal that the Kurds are not going to be the ones running the show, then Turkey will be satisfied with that. So that explains the Turkish-Russian kind of closeness. It's only, I would say, a product of circumstance rather than anything else. Turkey much prefers to stay in the Western camp, in the US camp. When it comes to Russia and Israel, this gets more interesting because this relationship has always been good, but Russia felt that its own alliance with Iran in Syria is useful and pragmatic. Why should Russia commit troops in Syria when Iran can provide this for Russia, at very low cost? So Russia was never in an alliance that is meant to be ideological or long-term when it comes to Iran. It was always about being kind of the bigger actor in this relationship. And this explains why whenever Iran started to threaten Israeli security in Syria by getting militias or Iranian operatives to get a bit too close to Israel, the Russians and the Israelis, as far as my sources tell me, have cooperated on information exchanges, which has allowed Israel to be able to essentially target Iranian targets in Syria. So Russia benefits from having Iran contained in Syria at the end of the day. But that does not mean that Russia is able to deliver Iran, where a settlement to this conflict to be kind of found somehow. So we shouldn't kind of look at this relationship as being Russia is dictating what Iran is doing. Russia, in fact, wants to be the broker in this conflict. And its interests and Israeli interests also coincide. And that's why, they have the sharing of information. But interestingly enough, this relationship between Israel and Russia is only just now starting to kind of surface when it comes to debate about Syria. In the past, everyone was just thinking Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel kind of was not playing much of a role. But then there's one reason why now suddenly we're beginning to think about Israel. It's because Israel is also not happy about the developments in Syria, this increased influence for Iran all over Syria, and it's getting increasingly nervous. And it's looking towards Washington for kind of a way out. And we go back here to what we were saying at the beginning about the West not really doing much and paving the way for the Russians and others to be involved in conflicts like Syria. Whenever you do not have US willpower, you're going to have all these other actors. Israel has been witnessing this. In the beginning, perhaps Israel did not want Assad out because he was convenient. But now he's not convenient anymore because of the Iranian proliferation on the ground. So if the US does not deliver, then Israel will be pushed to kind of take matters into its own hand.
Thank you. Andrew, I was really interested in what you were saying about this sort of two visions, this discrepant, dissonant visions. So in Europe, in the West, we're talking about, the debate is how to accept a continuation of the Assad regime, how to contain its excesses, for the transition towards peace and the reconstruction of Syria. And what you're saying is that in the region, it's not seen like this at all. Can I ask you to elaborate a bit more on how it's viewed, how the Syria piece is viewed from Saudi Arabia, from the other countries, and where, how can that feed into this misperception that is actually dominating the debate in the West?
So before I arrived here in Brussels, I was in Abu Dhabi, and then before that in Herzliya. So this trip, I've had a sort of tour of the different opinions on this. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I don't. The problem is that Assad has been winning the war based on a military intervention by Iran and Russia on his side. He has the trappings of a sovereign state, and then it's through the military intervention of the United States and the coalition, over 28% of the country, and then by Turkey, over about 15% of the country, and then you have some in some other pockets. So the problem is that as Iranian influence inside of Syria has grown, it's become, well, at least in Israeli circles, and I got this when I was in Herzliya, they believe that what the Iranians are trying to do is create a conventional deterrent in Syria to prevent Israel from striking their nuclear program into the future because of their concerns about its development, which have been pretty public. And they point to, it's not just militia, which is part of the Syrian war, so to speak, but the delivery of advanced weaponry, surface-to-surface missiles, rockets, and also anti-aircraft systems and so on. So I think the problem we have at the moment is that on the opposition side, most of the Gulf countries, like Israel, find the outcome of the war unacceptable, so to speak, but their prospects of working with the opposition have always been limited and torturous and divided. And so I don't think they have a backup plan, so to speak. There has been some talk about Arab Gulf countries, and President Trump has, and others have talked about this, contributing troops, contributing special forces into the problem is that U.S. allies in the region have a lot of advanced hardware, but very limited capacities until now. Yeah. So therefore, an intervention there in those opposition areas is, by regional parties, is limited. And then in the case of Israel, if you look at it, is really focused on air power. The problem is that, you know, the question is, can you bomb your way out of this problem? And I think the answer is no, because the Iranians have proven time and time again that once they burrow into a place and they begin to regenerate, that you can strike them all you want, mow the grass or whatever you want to call it, but they'll come back thicker and thicker every time unless there's a political plan or political military plan inside of Syrian territory. And until now, we don't have it. And I don't see that easily happening for a whole host of reasons that have to do with where U.S. policy is at the moment, where the world is at the moment on terms of the Syrian war, fatigue, and so therefore a lot of the problems that we spoke about in the opening remarks will remain in front of us for years to come.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about states and sort of rather hard-nosed policies and politics. I'd like to bring the attention perhaps to a sort of more human level and talk about refugees. This has been obviously for Europe, Syrian refugees, and the way in which European states have handled it has been hugely problematic. But now that the debate is moving towards looking at policies for returns, we're actually seeing that in the region this is deeply complicated, and that states in the region are also exploiting refugees to meet their own ends. So they're kind of victims of this chessboard. Lina, I would like to ask you just to expand a bit on this. What is the situation? We have refugees in neighboring countries. Assad's regime is trying to change the nature of the country demographically to prepare for the cessation of direct confrontation. So maybe you can say something about this. And also, just to add on this, looking at what are beyond the actors and the choices that might be made in the capitals of the regions. What are the real issues? What are the problems of fragility which will be there to stay for the years to come, regardless of who's in power?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with following up on something that Andrew just said, which is about the impossibility of bombing the problem and solving it that way, if we're talking about Israel's perspective, the Iranian problem in Syria. The thing is, Iran's presence in Syria is not just through military bases. It is also engaged in a very heavy, grassroots, bottom-up kind of campaign, if you want to call it that, of having influence on the ground through the population, through demographics. So we do not just have militias being supported by Iran coming to fight in Syria. We have the families of the fighters moving with them and being granted places to live and incentives in order to stay. We have incentives given to Syrians in order to basically support increased Shiaization inside Syria as a way to have social pockets of influence for Iran. We have the buying of property, we have the investment in businesses, etc. So what Iran is doing is part of the demographic change that Assad is orchestrating in Syria. And we've heard about some of this, the more extreme cases of villages, evacuated from their original residence to be replaced by people more favorable to the regime. This is definitely also happening with Iranian kind of blessing. So it's not just about Iran, it's also about Assad himself. What we've seen in Eastern Ghouta, for example, before that we saw that in other areas, whole areas are being targeted so that the original residents do not come back. They are meant to flee. So this is not about evacuation. This is essentially a deportation. It's a population transfer. And the regime wants these areas to stay relatively empty from these original residents. First, because it's easier for the regime to rule these areas that way. Second, because the regime wants to punish these areas. It wants to punish them because these are the areas that rose against the regime. So in the West, we are hearing this whole debate about reconstruction and return of refugees, which seems to be based on the assumption that the Assad regime wants the refugees to come back and wants IDPs to go back to their original areas at some point. The regime wants neither of these two things. And these demographic changes that are being orchestrated are very deliberate. The latest example is property rights and how law number 10 has been issued in Syria that basically tells people you have 30 days for you or a close relative to go in person to your local municipality, presenting deeds showing ownership of your property. Otherwise, your property would be confiscated by the state. Now, of course, the people who have fled Syria do not want to go back because any person who shows up has to be vetted security-wise and most likely going to be arrested and probably killed. Also, not everyone has the means to go back even if they wanted to, or people don't even have the deeds on them. You can imagine the kind of story, how complicated it is for people. It's almost impossible. So the regime is doing all these things because it does not want people to come back. And also with reconstruction, this is a very important issue for Europe. Yes, good. However, we shouldn't assume that the Assad regime wants to reconstruct the whole of Syria. What the regime is hoping for, at best, is to be able to use whatever money it can get for reconstruction to bolster areas where its own supporters live. But it wants to, again, punish the areas that rose against it. So there's not going to be equitable reconstruction. So the situation on the ground makes it very difficult for people to return. On the other hand, you look at the situation of refugees in a place like Lebanon, where politicians from across the political spectrum look at the issue of refugees first as a political rallying tool, as we saw in the recent parliamentary elections in Lebanon, increased racism towards Syrian refugees really happening, but essentially as a tool to extract money from the state. Because the foreign aid that is going to the Lebanese government, that the government is very keen to lobby Europe for, especially the EU, these politicians set up NGOs and charities and all kinds of mechanisms to be able to get procurement contracts from the various ministries dealing with the refugees so that they pocket the money for themselves. So you have a situation, if you're a refugee in a place like Lebanon, the situation inside Syria means with the new property law, you can't even go back and erect a tent, if your property has been destroyed. You can't even do that. And when it comes to Lebanon, most of the money is being stolen, really. So you're going to end up destitute. And this carries very, very strong implications for the future. We are, now seeing a new population being born in the refugee kind of communities in a place like Lebanon. The children don't have education. Lebanese law makes it very difficult for Syrian refugees to work. So what are these people going to do to make a living? So we have a ticking time bomb in the future. And meanwhile, everybody seems to be making policies based on the issue of refugees being a short-term thing, that as soon as the settlement happens, these people will go back. So it's much more complicated than that. And I think Europe should definitely think long-term and think about what it can do to mitigate all these things happening, such as the property rights issue in Syria, and not just look at the situation from a simple perspective of humanitarian assistance.
Well, this is not rather depressing note. I'd like to ask you both. I think we still have a few minutes before opening the conversation to participants here. What recommendations would you have? And I think some of them can be specific. For instance, how should the EU use its aid and deliver its aid in order for it to be not just humanitarian, but also to facilitate working rights, integration into the hosting countries of Syrian refugees? So that's at a very specific level, because the EU has been trying to find solutions creative solutions to this. But also, given that this is a conference which is also focusing on the dialogue between Europe and the US, given that there is explosive divergence at the moment, but there are also areas in which Europeans and Americans are working together. I'm thinking of fighting ISIS, for instance. What should be trying to be constructive, looking forward in a period in which the transatlantic relationship is under such strain? What areas should one focus on to converge and to develop policies together? And what areas where maybe it's best that actually the US and Europeans take slightly different paths? And I won't even introduce the question of European unity and whatever that path might be, but let's just stick to these. So Andrew, would you like to start?
So I think in the short to medium term, it's very important for the United States and the European countries to stay on the same page and to maintain very tight discipline over providing stabilization and reconstruction funding. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that, and the US has been very, I think, direct about this. I don't know about it in the European context. What Assad wants, what the Iranians want, what the Russians want is your money. They know they're not going to get it from President Trump because he's not going to give it, right? Everybody can probably figure that out. Right? He wants your money, right? He wants you to invest in this project which is not going to solve your problems. It's not going to have refugees going home in any meaningful way. It's going to cement Iran's advance in the region, and it's going to make the region more unstable so that more people end up migrating to Europe in the future. And the chance of that in interstate conflict, as that goes up, increases that likelihood. That is what the regime wants. They want credibility by you engaging with them, even privately. And the advantage that he has in this regard, unfortunately, is that Europe is a confederation, and therefore he can pick you off one by one. And this is a major, major problem. Right? So it's very important to stay on the same page, because if you don't stay on the same page, if you think that Assad's behavior is going to get better, or that of the Iranians or anyone else, that you are sadly mistaken. Right? But believe me, I've written a book on U.S. engagement with Syria over the years, even under Hafez al-Assad. You have to be extremely hard-nosed. You have to be very, very disciplined, and oftentimes we are not. Right? U.S. policy over the years has always vacillated between engaging and giving the Assad regime pretty much what it wants, and then confronting it mostly in a rhetorical fashion. So, but it begs the question, so while we all can maintain this discipline, how do you affect this outcome? I do think that it is important for the U.S. and for Europe to work towards a diplomatic settlement inside of Syria that involves not only the parties in there, but also the regional countries. And here, maybe Europe and the United States will not totally agree. And I don't expect it. One of the advantages is, if I was Europe, I would look at the U.S. has an opportunity to maintain a hard line and to be the sort of bad cop in this situation. And what I mean by that specifically, if you look, on a number of occasions that the United States has struck militarily inside of Syria, it has dramatically improved our negotiating position with the Russians and with the regime. Concerning the de-escalation agreement in southwest Syria was probably the first instance, but also it's the ongoing, unfolding saga of trying to make sure that the Assad regime, which is the only, I think, violator of the Chemical Weapons Convention in its 20-year history or something, make sure that the use of those weapons goes down and is not carried into the future. That's very much an open question. I'm not sure that can be achieved, into the future, but we need to be able to coordinate our policies to get an effective outcome that we all can live with.
And you were nodding in agreement. Do you think so? That would be the way forward? Good cop, bad cop, engage Russia, other partners, regional partners?
When it comes to the Syrian conflict in particular, I think we have driven ourselves to the corner, and now we have no choice but to engage Russia. But we shouldn't think that Russia can deliver Iran. We shouldn't think that Iran is going to take it lying down. There will be a bargain that Iran will negotiate. I think the US and Europe, when it comes to Iran in particular, the big mistake in my view is that, and here I find myself, on a rare occasion aligned with something that President Trump has said, which is criticizing the JCPOA, not because the JCPOA itself is not a good deal for what it's meant to do, but criticizing it on the basis that it should have been part of something larger. So this is the one moment that I'm saying, actually, yes, because I was one of the people who were trying to advocate for a package kind of solution when it comes to Iran back then, but nobody was interested, neither Europe nor the US. And now both are paying the price of this alignment, basically in position towards Iran. Gulf countries have grown resentful as a result of feeling that the JCPOA paved the way for Iran to behave as it did in Syria. Personally, I don't think it's the JCPOA that paved the way for Iran to do that. Iran was going to try to do that regardless of whether there was a nuclear deal or not. However, my point is, from the very beginning, the dealing with Iran should have been done in a more comprehensive way. So now with the JCPOA heading towards unraveling, as far as I can see, and maybe some people might disagree, but I think the US will make it very difficult for this agreement to kind of be implementable in the long term. Perhaps we can turn this to our advantage somehow, if what Andrew is proposing, is something that the US and Europe are willing to take on board, then perhaps this kind of schism on the JCPOA can be turned into a diplomatic advantage.
Thank you very much. We have about half an hour till 3:15, right? So I'd like to open the discussion also to participants here. I'm sure there are plenty of people who'd like to intervene. That's great. And, there's a great opportunity to pick two fantastic brains here, but also just to offer some comments. So microphones are you just lift the thing, yeah, and you've got to press a button and you can speak. And I'd like you to introduce yourself. And maybe if you could just stand up so we can get a better look at you, if you don't mind, please. There is a button to press inside the arms thing.
There's a button to push, I think. Yeah. Something's on.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, sorry again. Mona Alami from non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. I have two questions, actually. My first question is, when you spoke a few years ago to Hezbollah fighter, you would be told that Hezbollah was building infrastructure, underground infrastructure in southern Syria. However, when we look at the track record of Israeli recent strikes in Syria, we see that they're concentrated away from southern Syria, more in Homs, Hama, and these areas. So, Andrew, do you feel that maybe Iran is maybe stopped expanding in southern Syria? Do you think that Russia put pressure on Iran for stopping its expansion in southern Syria, which is why we're seeing more of a weight of Iran in other regions? My second question is that following the Syrian issue, I'm really surprised that given Iranian intervention there and Russian intervention there, we're not seeing more insurgency, the opposition moving into an insurgency and having a modus operandi of an insurgency attacks against Iranian presence, especially when we know the sectarian dimension of the war. Do you think that Turkey is raining down on the opposition, or regional countries are not are still working on another working approach against the regime or against Iran in Syria? Thanks.
Francesca.
Hi, I'm Francesca Fabri from the European Policy Center. Thank you for your very interesting conversation. I have a question related to another recent development, let's say, in the region. So the opening of the embassy of the US in Jerusalem. There have been very strong reactions already, and I think this is also related to the Iran deal. Is giving grounds for more escalation in the region. So if you could comment about that, also in relation to EU-US relation, because of course the EU is a strong advocate for the two-state solution and a member of the Quartet. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can start from this while others put their thinking cap on. Yes.
insurgency. I meant terrorist attack. I meant we're not seeing any terrorist attack against Russia and Iran in Syria. So that's a bit surprising.
Okay. So who would like to start this? I think it's for both of you.
Yeah.
The three questions are for both of you. So who wants to start?
Well,
You want me to go first? Or?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So concerning Iranian activities, so over the course of the war, there's been a lot of efforts by Israel and by Jordan to keep the rebels in control of areas adjacent to the Golan frontier and in the south. So that didn't happen by accident. And then the de-escalation agreement has helped deliver that to a certain extent. That would have gotten in the way of tunnel making activities. That wouldn't have stopped it, but it got in the way of it. So I would imagine this is what helped interrupt that. But Israel's main concern is these surface-to-surface missiles, air bases, other kinds of sophisticated weaponry in the near term. And so that's my best guess. My best guess at that one. Concerning the embassy move, so I was surprised when I was in Abu Dhabi. I think definitely when I was in Abu Dhabi, the Palestinian issue was very prevalent among the participants of the conference I attended, and it seemed meaningful to me. I think, however, it was a really distant second or third or fourth to the Iranian threat. And I think this is a major change. We just need to understand that while the Palestinian-Israeli problem has not been resolved, that has not been resolved, the Iranian threat has changed the context in a way that I think has changed their priorities, and therefore the likelihood of greater regional cooperation among these anti-Iranian, anti-Islamic Republic alliance, or whatever you want to call it, the anti-resistance bloc or whatever, will increase into the near future. How, I don't know.
Yeah, Mona, very good question on why we're not seeing this. And it has a lot to do with the external, basically, patrons that used to pump a lot of money and resources into these groups and are no longer doing so to a large extent. So Gulf countries have changed their strategy on Syria. First of all, because they saw that their previous strategy, which was, let's face it, based on supporting jihadist groups, thinking that this would be the quickest way to topple Assad, they saw that this did not work. Second, the Yemen conflict kind of escalating has become more of an immediate priority for them rather than Syria. Syria is no longer a priority. So why would they pump their resources into something when they have, something more relevant to kind of think about? And also the international pressure has helped. When it comes to Turkey, it has also been paying the price heavily for its own facilitation of fighters passing through Turkish territory to go and fight in all kinds of jihadist groups in Syria. So these groups no longer have the foreign support that they used to have, which also used to direct kind of their activities. That doesn't mean that, every now and then you don't see opportunistic attacks. They do happen, but they're very, very kind of small in scope. What might happen is if, and it's not likely so far, but if, let's say, Idlib is under attack, and the factions that are currently operating as more or less coherent factions with clear leaders and members, in Idlib, kind of fall apart, perhaps then we can see a scattering of these fighters doing the kind of thing you're describing. But right now, this is not likely to happen. So I would say it is a sign of how the situation on the ground in Syria is tightly connected to the strategies and wishes of the external actors.
Thank you. I have Paul, and then the gentleman here, and John Wiles. So, Paul, Ivan, there he is.
Just a question, if you can briefly talk about your expectations in terms of EU-US cooperation dialogue negotiations on the Iran file in, let's say, in the next months. What do you expect? We hear that European companies could be sanctioned. There's clear disagreement there. But what are your expectations in terms of that transatlantic dialogue on the Iran deal, or a possible future different Iran deal? Thank you.
And we'll take a few more yeah? Is that okay? So the gentleman here, and you managed to press the button?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Moussa Abdelblad from Brussels Times. I would like to ask both of you what you think about recent news from the EU-E3 Iran discussions yesterday here in Brussels about keeping to the nuclear deal. And as you know, they focused only on how to carry on with trade and economic relations despite the threat of American sanctions. So I have two questions about this. First, do you think that if EU would raise those other issues which are outside the deal and manage to do something about that, would that maybe prompt the United States to suspend their sanctions against Iran? And the second question is, because we know now from Mogherini's statement yesterday that she is focusing only on keeping the nuclear deal, but she said also that she thinks that we, EU, would be in a better position to raise other issues if we can stick to the deal and keep it alive. But the other issues, as about Iran's activities and so on in Syria and everywhere, and perhaps also the sunset clauses in the deal, she says they have to be dealt with separately. Do you think that that is the right approach? I mean, how would Iran react if EU would already now raise those other issues with them?
Thank you. You have John Wiles at the back.
I'll raise my voice. John Wiles.
Right, so we actually have 6 questions if I add them all together, so maybe we should start addressing them. So there were 3 actually on Iran really, and 2 on sort of Middle East, Israel, and then 1 on power relations and how this pans out. Andrew, do you want to start on looking at, because the first question was really also thinking about implications of what's going to happen in the US, what's going to happen in Washington.
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of things we can expect. One is that new sanctions have been put into place, will be put into place. I don't think that's, I think that's in the cards. Some of them.
Can I interrupt? Should Europeans stop hoping that things are going to get better from Washington? Would that be simpler?
Well, better in the sense of, I think.
We start taking Trump literally.
Well.
Take him seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these. It's one of these. I mean, I think you should take him pretty seriously. I mean, he's the president, and it's very difficult, despite all the news and so on. Whatever, it's a president in our system is there until, and it's a very long process for him not to be there. So I think he's the president of the United States. He can make these decisions, and now the question is, what can you do with this? Right? I mean, we all have to deal with these difficult situations in life. We need to be in diplomatically. So the question is this the end of the JCPOA? Or, and we have new sanctions and so on, or does the deal just tick along? The sanctions go up, Iran doesn't get the goodies that they want, and then it collapses on its own weight. Or are they able to renegotiate it in some fundamental way? And this is just to your point. It's an excellent question. And one that Lena said she was advocating for this as well. The problem with this agreement from the beginning was it was originally conceived by President Obama and his advisors when the region was a much more stable and peaceful place. Okay, geopolitical equilibrium, what the president has called it, offshore balancing, whatever you want to call this, was all conceived when the region was a stable place. Unfortunately, they had to implement this agreement on the nuclear when the region was at each other's throats, in domestically, regionally, so on. So, so the question is, how do you include Iran's ballistic missile activities, its activities in Syria, in Yemen, and so on, as part of a comprehensive deal? Will they accept it? I would imagine they will. I would imagine it would be very difficult for them to accept. Is it worth giving it a shot? Sure. But you know, we will have to see how much leverage does this give the United States over renegotiating the deal? How much leverage does it give you as Europeans to go to the Iranians and say, you know what? And to be fair to, I would say, to be fair to my European colleagues, I was here about 6 months ago. I heard the same concerns from you all about Iranian activities in the region too. You know why? Because their aggression, right? I mean, there's no other way to put it, right? When you're shooting other people into submission endlessly, then I mean, I think, you know, so I think we're on the same page in that regard. Your question about is the peace process dead? I retired from covering the peace process in the year 2000 as a young journalist. It was my first job because I never could really see the full end of it for a variety of reasons. It also broke down when I was in the year 2000 and thereafter. But do I think that it ends the search for peace? Does it end a chance to be able to settle this agreement? No. But, you know, Israel has remained a calm haven in the midst of a Middle East that is in upheaval. But the expansion of Iran has led to, and Israelis will be, they're pretty honest about this, a strategic failure. You know, when you have the Iranians encroaching on you from so many different directions, you are kind of the frog in warming water. And you know, I think they're trying to look at this situation strategically and think about how to alter it. And the Palestinian-Israeli issue might be part of that. I don't know. There is an attempt by the administration to try and get the talks going. I don't think those are likely to bear fruit immediately, but hopefully they do, and hopefully we can settle it. But you know, I'm afraid this might be something for children I don't have to settle someday. Yeah.
Can I just pursue the US point a little bit and the European thing? Because I get the impression that European capitals invest a lot of energy in trying to persuade President Trump not to follow through with what he pledged to do, and too little on focusing on, right, this decision, if it's not coming today, it will come tomorrow, and how can we react to it, respond to it, and what can we do? What are our options? So, and that's why I was saying they're not taking President Trump literally. I mean, he did say this months ago, that he would withdraw from the JCPOA. Whereas we've had, you know, various trips to Washington to persuade him of otherwise. Is that a waste of time? That's the reason I was asking you that question. I wasn't making a mockery of what comes out of Washington. I was saying we actually need to be listening a little bit more and focusing our energies on adjusting to new realities. Is this, you see, looking at it?
I would agree with you in that it's very important. I know this is hard. It's very important not to get caught up in the noise that surrounds all of these political problems we have in the United States, because there's a tremendous amount of it. So it's very important to understand that President Trump won the election and that he's the person you need to be dealing with. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone in the administration agrees on everything, right? But he's the president. And now, there are milestones in our system that come along, midterm elections and so on, which are coming up in this autumn of the general election. We'll have to see. We were talking a little bit earlier about you know, the Democrats' endless ability to what is it? To basically play their cards very badly and not end up with a unified message. We will have to see. till the end of this administration, you're going to have to deal with a president who feels very strongly on this, who feels that he's implementing his vision, whether we agree with it, anyone agrees with it or not. The thing to do is just to find out how to make the best of it, how to get something better out of it, and that's all we can do until such time as either he changes his mind, or or Americans change their mind, or whatever comes out of the democratic process.
But that brings, sorry, Lina, that brings me back to John's question, because if Europe has lost influence in Washington, which it appears it has, does this also mean that it's lost influence in the Middle East? Because I think that was the implication of John's question. Do you see that from where you stand? Or is there room for Europe?
There is room for Europe. I think it also depends on, there are some European parties that are closer to the president than others. So it's bilateral sort of in nature. I think, however, the administration spends a lot of time trying to talk with, corral European allies into common positions, either on the Iran nuclear agreement or on Syria or on a whole host of other issues. I think the US will continue to do this because this administration is almost Nixonian in many aspects. And what I mean by that is it looks to its allies and thinks, what can it do in tandem with its allies to achieve common objectives? Most notably in the region, it surrounds places like Syria, but also as concerns Europe. And Europe has a large role to play because, and I think President Trump has made this pretty clear, he says often, which is, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's accurate, the United States has spent $7 trillion in the Middle East. It doesn't really have much to show for it other than, a lot of bills and bad decision making. And so therefore he wants to talk about burden sharing. That's an opportunity for Europe, I think. And I think other panels have talked about this in other aspects. Yeah. But that's just my best guess.
Lina, how do you see things, maybe from a more European perspective?
Well, first of all, when it comes to the JCPOA, I don't think any of the European countries that are still part of this agreement is going to abandon the agreement. But when I say it's heading towards being unraveled, it's happening or going to, in my very pessimistic understanding, that's going to happen from the bottom up, because it's at the level of companies that will start thinking twice about having to deal with the sheer headache that the US is going to cause them if they're going to deal with Iran. And they might eventually decide cost-benefit analysis, this is just not going to be worth it. And one by one, as you know, when one big company pulls out, the rest start it's a ripple effect. So that's what's going to happen rather than Europe, deciding, oh, actually, yeah, let's also abandon this deal. When it comes to President Trump, I think it's a very important point. I know that European leaders are well-meaning. They are well-meaning in going to DC, making a big show out of talking to President Trump and trying to persuade him. However, the problem there is that, again, it's about misreading this presidency. This is actually going to achieve the opposite effect, because the election of Trump happened partly on the basis of a man who's presenting himself as being his own person with his own, views that he wants to translate into policy. He does not want to be seen as someone who is swayed. And how would this look from the perspective of Iran if the US is seen to change its mind based on lobbying from more junior partners? So it does not work. I think if there's going to be any form of lobbying going on, it has to happen behind closed doors at the very least. Let's not make big diplomatic shows out of Europe wanting to show that it's influential. Sorry, but this is my tiny piece of advice for European-US relations. It's a different era. As for European leverage in the Middle East, I don't think it's the US only that is to blame. I think both parties are to blame. And I go back 15 years. The invasion of Iraq is the first thing that got us to where we are today, and it's a shared responsibility between the countries that were involved in that invasion, primarily my own, which is the UK, as well as the United States. We're dealing with the repercussions of all that now. But when it comes to the context of the Arab uprisings, etc., I still say it is the lack of political will in the US that got us here, mainly the administration of Barack Obama. He may have been great domestically in the US, but when it comes to the Middle East, he completely got us to where we are today. The nuclear deal with Iran was something he was campaigning for before his first term. He wanted it to be his legacy no matter what. And now we're all sadly seeing the consequences of the no matter what. And this has had a negative effect on Europe's leverage because from the perspective of the Middle East, it's looked at as the West. And the West has abandoned us, and the West has said things and done other things, or even worse, did not do anything. So the gap between rhetoric and action has been the biggest plague for both. Now, as we're seeing with President Trump, some interesting developments on the level of actually transforming rhetoric into action. However, it remains to be seen what he's going to do regarding Syria, for example, regarding Iran beyond the JCPOA. This talk about a package agreement. Is there a strategy? Is there a policy? I, for one, am waiting very eagerly to see if one develops in the States, because sadly, when it comes to Europe, I think the best we can hope for is a supporting role rather than taking the lead in any of these issues.
I just want to add to Lena's comments, almost all of which I agree with. The size of the Iranian economy is roughly that of Maryland, I think. It's our 16th largest economy in the United States. I love Maryland. It's adjacent to D.C. I love the seafood there. I wouldn't end my economic life over wanting to trade with it, though, right? Because it's important to keep these things into perspective. We have a lot in common. We have, over the decades, had a lot in common. We will continue to have a lot in common strategically, economically, and so on going into the region. It's very important we all just stay rational and push ahead, and hopefully we end up in a better place.
Right. Well, if there aren't any further questions, I'd like to ask you both if you could just be a little bit imaginative, because being at the EPC brings me back when I was at the EPC, and we had some conversations, and there's one person there, I won't name the person, but who was rather pessimistic, which pushed me to being optimistic against my will, because the pessimistic interpretation is always easier. And when I look at this part of the world, I really struggle to see light at the end of the tunnel. So is there one building block that you think is priority in order to get to that light at the end of the tunnel? We've talked about, making sure that the US and Europe cooperate on Syria. Would that be the building block that could just bring in, that sort of agent of change? Or is there something else that we ought to happen? And I'd like your take on on this, yeah?
Okay, I'll start. We didn't talk much about Iraq, but I would say if there's one thing that the Europeans and the Americans agree on, it's stabilization in Iraq. Now, we can have a whole other conversation about all the challenges and how it's not as straightforward as it looks. However, Iran also does not want a destabilized Iraq. This gives us something to work with, because if you're going to work with Iran, there has to be some form of bargain, and I think Iraq could be part of that bargain. And the recent election results, as I said, were not expected in the West, but I can tell you, we did, at least at Chatham House. My colleague Renad Mansour, who leads our work in Iraq, back when we worked together in Beirut, he kind of wrote this article about Muqtada Sadr, and everybody thought Renad was crazy in highlighting this person as a figure who has evolved into becoming a nationalist figure who we should pay attention to. Everybody was putting Muqtada Sadr in the category of, cleric, he was a terrorist, etc. Politicians sometimes evolve into other pragmatic beings. So this pragmatism is something to work with. So we have something there in Iraq that we can actually work with. So I would say prioritize stabilization in Iraq, but let's have a whole other discussion about exactly what that means. But I think Iraq will have a very important domino effect on the rest of the region if we pay it the attention it deserves.
Andrew?
So,
I'm going to say something else, even if you agree with Lena.
No, I actually would take it. I would take it out further than that in terms of maybe something I learned from this whole crisis and so on. And I've had an opportunity to engage with a number with Russians, with Chinese over the course of this. Many of us have. And I think one of the things that I came away with in terms of trying to understand where we are as Western countries and where Russia is, and it's something building on what Lena was talking about in terms of stabilization, but to take it bigger. As liberal democracies, we believe that stability comes first, and from stability comes order. The Russians are the opposite. They think order comes first, and then from that is derived stability. Now, I realize these are not, these are not mutually exclusive things on all senses, but it is a fundamental difference, right? And so we need to focus together, I think, on, so if we want to create this stability, how do we respond rapidly and concisely as democracies to these broken states? Because if we don't, I fear that these authoritarian states will intervene in these areas, use them to divide us, and ultimately break up an alliance which has held since the end of the Second World War. And I think this is one of the great costs, geopolitical costs of the Syrian uprising. And the only way we can, I think, make sure that that doesn't lead to greater problems is by working together. We need to, how can we act together quickly and make decisions so that we can actually affect outcomes diplomatically, militarily, and so on in these broken states. Until we do, I'm afraid this trend will continue. Right. Well, thank you very much. We've covered a huge amount, a lot of ground here, with the positive and negative interpretations of what's happening. A lot to think about on different fronts. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge with us. Thank you, EPC and the US mission to the EU for organising this and putting together such a great panel. And thank you also for joining us and for your stimulating questions. Thank you.